June 28, 1914. An open car moves slowly through the streets of Sarajevo. Inside sit a man and a woman dressed for a formal visit. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his wife, Sophie. It is their 14th wedding anniversary. In a few minutes they will both be dead. And within 5 weeks so will millions of other people, in a war nobody has even declared yet. Historians still argue about almost every deep cause of the First World War: alliances, empires, arms races, decades of tension. But the spark, the single afternoon that lit all of it, comes down to something much smaller: one bullet and one wrong turn. Franz Ferdinand wasn't exactly the villain Serbian nationalists imagined. He was heir to one of the largest empires on earth, yes, but inside the Austro-Hungarian court, he was also seen as a troublemaker. He favored a plan called trialism, giving the empire's Slavic peoples, including Bosnian Serbs, a real seat at the table, on equal footing with Austria and Hungary. It made him deeply unpopular with hardliners back home, who saw any concession to minorities as weakness. In a strange way, the man Serbian nationalists were about to kill was one of the few people in Vienna actually trying to diffuse the tension between empire and minority. That's not the story that gets remembered. This is. By 1914, the Balkans had a nickname: the powder keg of Europe. 6 years earlier, in 1908, Austria-Hungary had formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, a region with a large Serbian population that dreamed of joining a greater Serbia instead, backed by their fellow Slavs in Russia. Then in 1912 and 1913, 2 Balkan wars redrew the region's map again, and Serbia came out of them larger, stronger, and more confident than it had been in generations. Some Serbian nationalists didn't just resent the Austrian annexation. They organized a secret military society called the Black Hand, formally unification or death, trained and armed radicals willing to kill for the cause, with quiet support from inside Serbia's own military intelligence. When word came that the Archduke himself was touring Sarajevo on June 28th, Serbia's own solemn day of national mourning, the Black Hand saw an opportunity too good to pass up. Franz Ferdinand was in Bosnia to inspect army maneuvers, in his role as Inspector General of the Armed Forces. But there was a second, quieter reason he brought Sophie. Their marriage had never been accepted by the Habsburg court. Sophie came from a noble family, just not a royal one, not royal enough. To marry her at all, Franz Ferdinand had to sign away his own children's rights to the throne. At official court functions, Sophie couldn't walk beside him, sit beside him, even ride in the same carriage. But military inspections followed different rules. Out here on tour, they could finally appear together, in public, simply as husband and wife. This trip was one of the only chances all year they had to do that. Waiting along the planned route that morning were 7 young conspirators, spread out along the Appel Quay at intervals, each armed with a bomb, a pistol, or a vial of cyanide, and orders to strike wherever they got a clear shot. Most were teenagers, recruited and armed through the Black Hand's smuggling network. The one history remembers, Gavrilo Princip, was 19 years old, a frail, tubercular student who had already been turned down once by Black Hand leadership as physically too weak for the job. As the motorcade actually rolled past their positions, one after another, several of the 7 lost their nerve completely and let the cars go by without acting at all. It would only take one of them succeeding. At 10 past 10 that morning, as the motorcade passed the second conspirator's position, Nedeljko Kabranovic threw his bomb at the Archduke's car. It bounced off the folded canvas roof and rolled underneath the vehicle behind it before exploding, wounding somewhere between 16 and 20 bystanders and officers. Kabranovic swallowed his cyanide capsule and jumped into the river to escape capture, except the poison was old and only made him vomit, and the river, in high summer, was barely ankle-deep. He was dragged out of the water and beaten by the furious crowd before police could reach him. Franz Ferdinand himself was completely unhurt, and astonishingly, He insisted the day's program continue exactly as planned. At the town hall, the mayor began reciting his prepared welcome speech as if nothing at all had happened. Franz Ferdinand cut him off. "Mr. Mayor," he said, "I came here on a visit and I am greeted with bombs. It is outrageous." Then, after an awkward pause, he let the mayor simply continue. Before leaving, Franz Ferdinand insisted on one more stop, against his staff's advice: the hospital, to personally check on the officers wounded in the morning's bombing. It was a decent, human instinct. It would also turn out to be a fatal one. To reach the hospital safely, away from the crowded route, the itinerary was changed at the last minute. Nobody thought to tell the driver. Leopold Lodgka steered the car onto the original road, Franz Joseph Street, exactly as he'd been briefed that morning, and exactly wrong. General Oskar Potirek, riding along in the car, shouted at him that he'd taken the wrong turn entirely. Lodgka slammed on the brakes and began reversing, right in front of a small delicatessen on the corner, directly in front of Gavrilo Princip, who had already given up on the plan and was simply standing there. The engine stalled. For a few seconds, the most heavily guarded car in the city sat motionless, an arm's length from the one conspirator still in position. Princip stepped off the curb, drew his pistol, and fired twice from less than 2 meters away. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. At first, neither of them understood how badly they were hurt. Franz Ferdinand turned to his wife. "Sophie, Sophie," he said, "don't die. Stay alive for our children." A count riding with them, holding him upright, asked if he was in pain. Franz Ferdinand answered, "It is nothing, es ist nichts," and kept repeating it quietly until he stopped. Sophie was already gone. He died a few minutes later. It was, to the day, their 14th wedding anniversary. Princip tried to turn the pistol on himself and swallow his own cyanide capsule, but the crowd wrestled him to the ground before he could finish either. He was born on July 25, 1894, meaning on the day of the shooting. He was 3 weeks short of turning 20, and so, under Austro-Hungarian law, 3 weeks too young for the death penalty. He was sentenced instead to 20 years hard labor. Conditions in his cell were brutal. Tuberculosis, which was already in his body before the trial even began, slowly took over. He died in an Austrian prison in April 1918, malnourished and largely forgotten. Just 7 months before the war, he had ignited finally, exhaustedly, ground to a halt. Several of his older accomplices, judged old enough to hang, were executed. Princip, the man who actually pulled the trigger, was not. In Vienna, the mood shifted fast. This was the moment to punish Serbia and settle the threat for good. But Austria-Hungary was wary of taking on Serbia's protector, Russia, alone, so before acting, it asked its ally Germany for support. On July 5, Kaiser Wilhelm II gave it, unconditionally. Historians call it the blank check. Germany would back Austria-Hungary militarily, no matter what action it decided to take. Some in the German High Command privately welcomed the excuse. They believed Russia's army was growing fast and would soon be unbeatable. Better, in their eyes, to fight a big war now than a bigger one later. Emboldened by Berlin's promise, Austria-Hungary spent nearly 4 weeks drafting an ultimatum to Serbia, deliberately harsh enough that it was expected to be refused. On July 23, almost a month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary finally delivered it. 10 demands, with just 48 hours to answer in full. Serbia had to suppress anti-Austrian publications, dissolve nationalist societies like the Black Hand, remove certain officers from its army, and, in the demand that mattered most, allow Austrian officials onto Serbian soil to help investigate the plot themselves. Serbia, stunned, accepted nearly everything. Britain's own Foreign Secretary, reading it, called it the most formidable document he had ever seen addressed by one state to another. But nearly everything wasn't enough. Serbia balked at Austrian officials operating inside its own courts, a direct hit on its sovereignty, and Austria-Hungary treated that single reservation as a rejection. On July 28, exactly 1 month after the shooting, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Notice how much time that took, nearly a full month between the killing and the ultimatum. For most of July, ordinary Europeans went about their summer as normal: beaches, cafes, newspapers, moving on to other stories. For a few weeks, it looked like the crisis might simply fade, the way earlier Balkan crises had. Behind closed doors, it hadn't faded at all. Ambassadors were cabling warnings back to their capitals. Military staffs across the continent were quietly dusting off mobilization plans written years in advance, for exactly this kind of moment, and never actually tested. Once Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28th, that hidden, month-long calm evaporated in days. What followed should have stayed a small, contained war between two countries. It didn't, because of a decade of overlapping alliances and military machinery nobody had fully tested. Russia had pledged to protect Serbia, and on July 30th, ordered general mobilization of its entire army. Its own generals had warned the Tsar that a smaller, partial mobilization wasn't something their pre-war planning could actually deliver. Germany, allied to Austria-Hungary, demanded Russia stand down within 12 hours. When Russia didn't, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. France, bound to Russia by treaty, began mobilizing too, so Germany declared war on France on August 3rd. To knock France out quickly, Germany's own pre-war plan sent its army marching straight through neutral Belgium. And Britain, which had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality for 75 years, declared war on Germany on August 4th. One bullet, 5 weeks. 5 great powers now at war, through an alliance system that had been built originally to prevent exactly this. By the time the guns finally fell silent 4 years later, the war had killed somewhere around 20 million people, soldiers and civilians combined, and wounded 20 million more. 4 empires, Austro-Hungarian, German, Russian, and Ottoman, collapsed completely. Borders across Europe and the Middle East were redrawn from scratch, some of them still disputed today. The peace treaty that followed punished Germany so harshly that it helped fuel the resentment which, 20 years later, dragged the world into a second, even deadlier war. All of it traceable back to a stalled engine, a wrong turn onto the wrong street, and one 19-year-old who happened to still be standing there. That's what makes this a turning point, and not just a tragedy. Franz Ferdinand's assassination didn't cause the First World War the way a match causes a fire that was always going to happen anyway. Europe's alliances, its arms race, its colonial rivalries, all of that had been flammable for years. But it still needed a spark at one specific place on one specific afternoon, and it very nearly didn't get one. Take away the wrong turn, the driver simply follows the new route, and Gavrilo Princip never gets a clean shot. Maybe the crisis passes. Maybe war comes some other year for some other reason. Or maybe it never comes at all. Instead, a stalled engine, a few wasted seconds outside a delicatessen, and history tipped into the deadliest conflict humanity had seen up to that point. A bomb that missed, a speech cut short by outrage, a wrong turn onto the wrong street, 2 shots fired from less than 2 meters away. A month of uneasy calm, then 5 great powers at war within 5 days of each other. 20 million dead, 4 empires gone, and a map of the world redrawn around a single afternoon in Sarajevo. This is a turning point.